The excessive force police officers used during the arrest of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May the 25th has led to protests across the city, which have spread to other US states and even other countries as people demand an end to racial injustice.
I think we're at a tipping point, to be honest with you. I think that this is what happens when you have hundreds of years of oppression and hundreds of years of peaceful protests that seemingly accomplish nothing.
African Americans often face prejudicial treatment in the country. There are more black people in American jails than any other race. There have been many incidents of the use of excessive force against them by police officers. They are also among the most economically disadvantaged groups in the country, and the poverty rate is higher among them than all other ethnicities except Native Americans. On average, African American men and women earn $946,000 less during a 40-year career compared to their white peers. The unemployment rate is twice as high among black people compared to other races, according to the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. And less than 3% of the 500 largest companies in the country are headed by African Americans and Latinos. This disenfranchisement may have led to looting and vandalism of luxury brands in some cities, but many protesters have turned out to help these businesses get going again.
Everybody's just converged onto Fairfax to stand in solidarity with this community and start putting the pieces back together. It's great. It makes you remember, that there are some silver linings to all of the sadness and pain and heartache and lack of leadership that we see from Washington.
In a bid to restore calm, curfews are being imposed in at least 40 cities. That's driving large retailers like Target, Apple, and Amazon-owned Whole Foods to temporarily shut down their outlets. Many are also voicing support for demonstrators, with YouTube and some others pledging funds to help end social injustice. Still, the closures are taking a toll on large and small companies, many of which had only just resumed business after weeks under lockdown, which means making a living could become even more difficult, especially for America's most economically disenfranchised people. Mobin Nasir, TRT World.
Well, for more on the story, let's speak to our correspondent in Washington, D.C., Sally Ayhan. Hi, welcome to the program, Sally. Now, we've seen violence across the US spread over the last week, and sadly, you've actually been injured by the police in one incident. Can you just give us the latest on what's happening there? Are we seeing any signs of things calming down?
Well, we're already starting to see a group of protesters right in front of me gather in front of the White House now. There's probably about 100 people so far, but we're likely to see those numbers increase this afternoon. We're certainly seeing much more peaceful protests today generally across the country, but that's often been the theme these last few days. They start out fairly peaceful, and then as night falls, things start to get a little bit more aggressive and violent. But keeping in mind it's a small percentage of those mostly peaceful protesters who are expressing their message through violence. Now, we have heard from President Donald Trump apparently speaking to governors and mayors in cities, saying that they need to work harder to crack down on these protesters, that any protester seen throwing bricks and rocks should be thrown in jail for at least 10 years. He said the problem will go away if you do that. So let's wait and see whether or not we'll see more law enforcement on the streets of Washington, D.C. and other cities tonight. The National Guard has been deployed to half a dozen cities across the nation. And a new curfew has been set in place for the capital this evening. So 7 p.m., which last night, of course, the 11 o'clock was the curfew, and that's when we saw the most fierce clashes between protesters and law enforcement. So we could be looking at potentially earlier clashes tonight.
Now, we are seeing this mix of images right now, aren't we? So there's scenes of peaceful protests against racism and police brutality that initially erupted on the streets have been drowned out largely by scenes of wanton destruction, people looting businesses. Firstly, do we know who's responsible and where is this happening the most?
Well, in my own bird's eye view experience that I had just a couple of nights ago, it's a very small number of people who want to act out and use the protest as an opportunity to be violent, to smash windows and to burn cars. And that is an unfortunate experience of these protests. But according to police chiefs, they're saying that they're arresting people from a vast range of backgrounds, a vast range of colours and ethnicities, and from all sorts of areas. Of course, we've heard reports of people travelling into big centres to take part in these protests and bring that violence. Here in Washington, D.C., I understand there's been several arrests in the tens over the last couple of nights. Anything really from battery to assault to looting. But when you look around the city now, you can see plenty of businesses now boarding up their shop fronts. They're desperately trying to protect their businesses. And of course, off the back of a current pandemic, they're trying to board up what little they have left.
Now, as we know, the US economy was paralysed after weeks of coronavirus lockdowns, and businesses had only just begun to reopen after those lockdown restrictions. What impact is this violence across the country having on attempts to really kickstart the US economy?
It's having massive attempts. There's huge companies that are having to close down their stores, like Walmart across major cities like Los Angeles and New York. Also, Target has announced on Saturday that it had to close down 175 stores because of these protests. So it just goes to show the kind of risk and threat that these protests have had on these major companies that are only just starting to try and open up. Also here in Washington, D.C., some boutique-y kind of stores were looted from in a very historic, wealthy area called Georgetown. Nike, Adidas also had to board up their shops and close down some of their stores only just from opening up a couple of days ago. So this is having a massive impact on businesses here. Mayor Muriel Bowser here in Washington, D.C. Pleaded to protesters to say, please do not make businesses another victim of these protests. Send your message without causing more harm and more economic damage on such already a vulnerable situation for business owners.
Okay, Sally Ayhan in D.C. Thank you so much for that, and do stay safe.